Welcome to the Cozy Tales Collective, your snug little corner for settling in with a comforting bedtime story. Tonight, I'm excited to share with you A Waif of the Mountains by Edward Sylvester Ellis. Before we dive into our story, if you love relaxing with bedtime tales and gentle affirmations, please consider subscribing to our channel. And if you'd like to support us further, a quick click on the like button would mean the world. Thank you so much for your kindness and support. Have a wonderful night and enjoy tonight's bedtime story. Now, it was the parson who now broke in. Why do we sit here, lamenting that which cannot be helped? Do you mean to give up, Captain, and let her go? Will you settle down to toil in the diggings, giving her no further thought, while this pretty-faced lieutenant is chuckling over the clever manner by which he fooled you as well as us? No, fairly shouted the roused parent. I will follow them to the ends of the earth. They shall not find a foot of ground that will protect them. She has never seen me angry, but she shall now. We are with you, coolly responded Brush, but only on one condition. What's that? That this account is to be settled with him alone. You mustn't speak so much as a cross word to Nellie. She will shed many a bitter tear of sorrow. She will drain the cup to its dregs. He, the cause of it all, is to be brought to judgment. When do you wish to take up the pursuit? Now. And we are with you. There was something wonderful in the way Parson Brush kept control of himself. Externally, he was as calm as when standing in front of the adamantine blackboard, giving instruction to Nellie Dawson, while down deep in his heart raged a tempest such as rouses into life the darkest passions that can nerve a man to wrongdoing. Believing it necessary to stir the father to action, he had done it by well-chosen words that could not have been more effective. For weeks and months the shadow had brooded over him. Sometimes it seemed to lift and dissolve into unsubstantiality, only to come back more baleful than before. And the moment when he had about persuaded himself that it was but a figment of the imagination, it had sprung into being and crushed him. But he was now stern, remorseless, resolute, implacable. It was much the same with Wade Ruggles. He strove desperately to gain the remarkable control of his feelings, displayed by his comrade, and partly succeeded. But there was a restless fidgeting which caused him to move aimlessly about the room and showed itself now and then in a slight tremulousness of the voice and hands, but his eyes wore that steely glitter which those at his side had noticed when the rumble and grumble told that the battle was on. Captain Dawson went from one extreme to the other, crazed, tumultuous in his fury, and at first like a baffled tiger, he moderated his voice and manner until his companions wondered at his self-poise. They have started for Sacramento and are now well advanced over the trail, he remarked without any evidence of excitement. When do you imagine they set out? Asked Brush. Probably about the middle of the afternoon, possibly earlier. Then, said Ruggles, they have a good 6 hours start. They haven't lost any time and must be 15 or 20 miles away. The trail is easy traveling for twice that distance as I recollect it, observed the captain. After that it grows rougher and they will not be able to go so fast. This must have been arranged several days ago, though it is only guesswork on our part. Of course she has taken considerable clothing with her." "I did not look into her room," said the captain. "There's no use. It is enough to know they made their preparations and started, accompanied by that dog Timon. No time was wasted. They knew they would encounter cold weather, for the autumn had fairly set in, and some portions of the trail carried them to an elevation where it was chilly in midsummer. Each took a thick blanket. The captain donned his military coat, with the empty sleeve pinned to the breast, caught up his saddle and trappings, his Winchester and revolver, and buckled the cartridge belt around his waist. Then he was ready. Neither of the others took coat or vest. The blanket flung around the shoulders was all that was likely to be needed, in addition to the heavy flannel shirt worn summer and winter. Thus equipped, the three stood outside the cabin with the moon high in the sky, a gentle wind sweeping up the canyon and loose masses of clouds drifting in front of the orb of night. Here and there a light twinkled from a shanty, and the hum of voices sounded faintly in their ears. Further off, at the extreme end of the settlement, stood the heavenly bower, with the yellow rays streaming from its 2 windows. They could picture the group gathered there, as it had gathered night after night during the past years, full of jest and story, and with never a thought of the tragedy that had already begun. "Shall we tell them?" asked Ruggles. "No," answered Brush. "Some of them might wish to go with us." "And it might be well to take them," suggested Captain Dawson. "We are enough," was the grim response of the parson. Like so many phantoms, the men moved toward the further end of the settlement. Opposite the last shanty a man assumed form in the gloom. He had just emerged from his dwelling and stopped abruptly at sight of the trio of shadows gliding past. "What's up, pards?" he called. "Nothing," was the curt answer of the captain, who was leading and did not change his pace. "You needn't be so huffy about it," growled the other, standing still and puffing his pipe until they vanished. "That was Vose Adams," remarked the captain over his shoulder. "He'll tell the rest what he saw, and it will be known to everybody in the morning." The little party was carefully descending the side of the canyon, with now and then a partial stumble, until they reached the bottom of the broad valley where the grass grew luxuriantly nearly the whole year. It was nutritious and succulent, and afforded the best of pasturage for the few horses and mules belonging to the miners. Captain Dawson and Lieutenant Russell had ridden up the trail, each mounted on a fine steed, which had brought them from Sacramento. When the saddles and bridles were removed, the animals were turned loose in the rich pasturage, which extended for miles over the bottom of the canyon. There, too, grazed the pony of Nellie Dawson, the horses of Ruggles and Bidwell, and the 3 mules owned by landlord Ortiges and Vose Adams. The latter were left to themselves, except when needed for the periodical journeys to Sacramento. The little drove constituted all the possessions of New Constantinople in that line. Consequently, if any more of the miners wished to join in the pursuit, they would have to do so on foot or on muleback, a fact which was likely to deter most of them. In the early days of the settlement, before the descent of that terrible blizzard, fully a dozen mules and horses were grazing in the gorge, subject to the call of their owners, who, however, did not expect to need them unless they decided to remove to some other site. But one morning every hoof had vanished and was never seen again. The prints of moccasins here and there in the soft earth left no doubt of the cause of their disappearance. Perhaps this event had something to do with the permanence of New Constantinople, since the means of a comfortable departure with goods, chattels, tools, and mining implements went off with the animals. After that, the miners made no further investments in quadrupeds, except to the extent of 3 or 4 mules needed by Vos Adams, though he was forced to make one journey to Sacramento on foot. Thus matters stood until the addition of the horses. There was always danger of their being stolen, but as the weeks and 165 months passed, without the occurrence of anything of that nature, the matter was forgotten. The 3 men were so familiar with the surroundings that they made their way to the bottom of the canyon with as much readiness as if the sun were shining. Pausing beside the narrow winding stream, which at that season was no more than a brook, they stood for several minutes peering here and there in the gloom for the animals indispensable for a successful pursuit of the eloping ones. "There's no saying how long it will take to find them," remarked the captain impatiently. "It may be they have been grazing a mile away." "Have you any signal which your animal understands?" "Yes, but it is doubtful if he will obey it." Captain Dawson placed his fingers between his lips and emitted a peculiar tremulous whistle, repeating it 3 times with much distinctness. Then all stood silent and listening. "He may be asleep. Once he was prompt to obey me, but he has been turned loose so long that there is little likelihood of his heeding it." "Try it again, and a little stronger," suggested Ruggles. The captain repeated the call until it seemed certain the animal must hear it, but all the same, the result was nothing. It was exasperating for the hounds thus to be held in leash when the game was speeding from them, with the scent warm, but there was no help for it. "We are wasting time," said Dawson. "While you 2 go up the gorge, I will take the other direction. Look sharp for the animals that are probably lying down. They are cunning and will not relish being disturbed. If you find them, whistle, and I'll do the same." They separated, the captain following one course and his friends the other. "It'll be a bad go," remarked Ruggles, "if we don't find the horses, for we won't have any show against them on their animals." "Little indeed, and yet it will not hold us back." "No, indeed," replied Ruggles with a concentration of passion that made the words seem to hiss between his teeth. Since the stream was so insignificant, Wade Ruggles leaped across and went up the canyon on the other side, his course being parallel with his friends. 100 yards further, and he made a discovery. "Hello, Brush. Here they are." The parson bounded over the brook and hurried to his side, but a disappointment followed. The 3 mules, having cropped their fill, had lain down for the night, but the horses were not in sight. The pursuers. The parson expressed his disappointment in vigorous language, when, instead of the horses, The hybrids proved to be the only animals near them. "I'm afraid this proves one thing," he said. "What is that?" "I've had a dread all along that the Indians would run off the horses, but it seems to me that if they had done so, they would have taken the mules. It strikes me as more likely that the lieutenant took the horses, so as to prevent our following him and the gal." "That sounds reasonable," said the parson thoughtfully. "The plan is so simple that it must have occurred to him. The mules are too slow to be of any use to us, and it may be as well that we shall have to go afoot." "How do you figure that out?" "They will conclude that if we haven't any horses, we won't follow them. They will therefore take their time and travel so slow that we'll have the chance to swoop down on them when they are not expecting it. I suppose there's what you call philosophy in that, but it doesn't hit me very favorable. We'll see what the cap thinks. Hello?" Clearly and distinctly through the still air came the signal by which Captain Dawson was to announce his discovery of the animals. The call scattered all thoughts of making the journey on foot, and, wheeling about, the two started off at a rapid pace to join their friend. At the same moment the call sounded again, and they answered it to let it be known they understood the situation. In a brief time they came upon Captain Dawson impatiently awaiting them. There was no need for him to tell them he had been successful in his search, for he was standing beside the 3 horses, which were quickly saddled and bridled. A minute later the men vaulted upon their backs, and the captain said crisply, "Now we are off." Each seemed to be inspired by the spirit of adventure. They sat erect in the saddles, drew in a deep inhalation of the keen night air, and moved off with their horses on a brisk walk, which almost immediately became a canter. For a mile the trail through Dead Man's Gulch was nearly as hard and even as a country highway. The width of the canyon varied from a few rods to a quarter of a mile, with the mountain ridges on either hand towering far up into cloudland, the tallest peaks crowned with snow which the sun never dissolved. The tiny stream wound like a silvery serpent through the stretch of green, succulent grass, narrowing gorge and obtruding rock and boulder. Now and then the path led across the water, which was so shallow that it only plashed about the fetlocks of the horses. Captain Dawson, in his impetuosity, kept a few paces in front of the other 2, as if he were the leader. When the space increased too much, he reined up his animal and waited until his friends joined him. They were grim, resolute, and for most of the time had little to say to one another, though, as may be supposed, their thoughts were of anything but a pleasant nature. So long as the moon held her place near the zenith, the canyon was suffused and flooded with its soft radiance, but the rifts of clouds drifting before its face rendered the light at times treacherous and uncertain. The horses had rested so long, and had had such extensive browsing on the rich pasturage, that they were in fine condition, and the gallop seemed more grateful to them than an ordinary walking gait. The air was cool, and the fine trail, at this portion of the journey, made all the conditions favorable. After a time, however, the ascent and descent would appear. The ground would become rough, and the best the animals could do would be to walk. When Parson Brush remarked that Lieutenant Russell had proved himself an idiot when he left these horses behind for his pursuers to use, the captain and Ruggles agreed with him. "I don't understand it," said Brush. "He must have expected we would be hot after him within the very hour we learned of what he had done. Or can it be that he and she concluded we would say, 'Depart in peace'? If so, the young man shall have a terrible awakening." "It seems to me," said Ruggles, "that it is more likely he believed that with the start he would gain, it didn't matter whether we followed or not, feeling sure that he could keep out of reach and get to Sacramento so far ahead of us that he needn't give us a thought." "I am not very familiar with the trail," remarked the captain, "for as you know, I have passed over it only twice. First, nearly 5 years ago, when I went to the war, and a few months since when I came back." "But you and Russell did not lose your way," said the parson. "That was because we did our traveling by day. We tried it once at night, but came within a hair of tumbling over a precipice 1,000 feet deep. This will be easy enough so long as we have the sun to help us. You probably know as much about the trail as Wade and I, for neither of us has been over it often. Consequently, when we travel by night, we shall have to go it blind, or rather shall do so after a while, since all is plain sailing now." "I ain't so sure of that," observed Ruggles doubtfully. "We must have come a mile already and ought to have made a turn by this time." Captain Dawson checked his horse and peered ahead. "Can it be we are off the track? We have come nearer 2 miles than 1. Ah!" Just then the moon emerged from the obscuring clouds, and their field of vision so broadened that they saw themselves face to face with an impassable barrier. The cannon closed directly in front of them like an immense gate of stone. It was impossible to advance 100 feet further. "Well, I'm blessed if this isn't a pretty situation," exclaimed the captain. "We have passed the opening, but we haven't far to return. And you know that a bad beginning brings a good ending." "Humph! I would rather chance it on a good beginning." Ruggles was the first to wheel and strike his horse into a gallop, which he did with the remark that he knew where the right passage was located. His companions were almost beside him. The cannon was of that peculiar conformation that, while it terminated directly in front, it contained an abrupt angle between where the party had halted and the mining settlement. At that point it was so wide that the little stream, which might have served for a guide, was lost sight of. Had they followed the brook, they would not have gone astray. The only inconvenience was the slight delay, which in their restless mood tried their spirits to the utmost. Captain Dawson muttered to himself and urged his horse so angrily that he again placed himself in advance. His mood was no more savage than that of his companions, but he chafed at everything which caused delay, no matter how trifling, in the pursuit. Fearing that he might go wrong, Ruggles spurred up beside him. The distance passed was less than anyone expected it to be, when Ruggles called out, "Here we are!" The exclamation was caused by the hoofs of their horses plashing in the water. They seemed to share the impatience of their riders. "All we have to do now is to keep to the stream, observe its turn. Its course was almost at right angles to that which they had been following. The animals were cantering easily, when suddenly a deeper gloom than usual overspread the valley like a pall. This came from a heavy bank of clouds sweeping before the moon. The steeds were drawn down to a walk, but the obscurity was not dense enough to shut out the chasm-like opening where the mountains seemed to part, riven by some terrific convulsion ages before. The enormous walls drew back the door as if to invite them to enter and press the pursuit of the couple that were fleeing from a just and righteous wrath. The width of the canon had now dwindled to a few yards, and the stream, expanding and shallow, occupied so much of the space that the horses were continually splashing through it. But the rise and fall of the trail was so slight that the gallop might have continued with little danger of mishap. The formation of the party was in Indian file, with Captain Dawson leading, Ruggles next, and Brush bringing up the rear. All three animals were walking, for the light of the moon was variable and often faint, while the danger of a misstep was ever present, and was likely to bring a fatal ending of the pursuit almost before it had fairly begun. Occasionally the gloom in the narrow gorge was so deep that they distinguished one another's figures indistinctly, but the animals were left mostly to themselves. They seemed to know what was expected of them, and showed no hesitation. It was impossible for them to go wrong, for it was much the same as if crossing a bridge, with its protecting barrier on either hand. The horse of the captain showed his self-confidence once or twice by a faint whinny and a break from the walk into a trot, but his rider checked him. "Not yet. Heaven knows that I am as anxious to push on as you, but we have already made one blunder and we can't afford another. When the time comes that it is safe to trot, you shall do so and perhaps run." "Hush!" called Brush from the rear. "I hear a curious sound." "What does it seem to be?" "It is impossible to tell. Let's stop for a moment." As the three animals stood motionless, the strange noise was audible. It was a deep, hollow roar, rapidly increasing in volume and intensity, and resembled the warning of a tornado or cyclone advancing through the forest. The animals, as is the case at such times, were nervous and frightened. They elevated their heads, pricked their ears, snuffed the air, and the animal of the parson trembled with terror. The three believed that something in the nature of a cyclone was approaching, or it might be a cloudburst several miles away, whose deluge had swollen the stream into a rushing torrent that would overwhelm them where they stood, caught inextricably in a trap. The terrifying roar, however, was neither in front nor at the rear, but above them, over their heads. From the first warning to the end was but a few seconds. The sound increased with appalling power, and every eye was instinctively turned upward. In the dim obscurity they saw a dark mass of rock, weighing hundreds of tons, descending like a prodigious meteor, hurled from the heavens. It had been loosened on the mountain crest a half-mile above, and was plunging downward with inconceivable momentum. Striking some obstruction, it rebounded like a rubber ball against the opposite side of the gorge, then recoiled, still diving downward, oscillating like a pendulum from wall to wall. whirling with increasing speed until it crashed to the bottom of the gorge with a shock so terrific that the earth and mountain trembled. Landing in the stream, the water was flung like birdshot right and left, stinging the faces of the men 50 feet distant. They sat awed and silent until Ruggles spoke. "Now if that stone had hit one of us on the head, it would have hurt." "Probably it would," replied the captain, who had difficulty in quieting his horse. "At any rate, I hope no more of them will fall till we are out of the way." "I wonder whether that could have been done on purpose," remarked the parson. "No," said Ruggles. "The lieutenant couldn't know anything about our being purty near the right spot to catch it." I alluded to Indians, not to him. But Ruggles and the captain did not deem such a thing credible. A whole tribe of red men could not have loosened so enormous a mass of stone, while, if poised as delicately as it must have been, they would have known nothing of the fact. Sometimes an immense oak, sound and apparently as firm as any in the forest around it, suddenly plunges downward and crashes to the earth, from no imaginable cause. So vast masses of rock on the mountainside, which have held their places for centuries, seem to leap from their foundations and tear their way with resistless force into the valley below. This was probably one of those accidental displacements, liable to occur at any hour of the day or night, which had come so startlingly near crushing the 3 men to death. Captain Dawson drew a match from his pocket and, scraping it along his thigh, held it to the face of his watch. "Just midnight, and we are not more than 6 miles from home." "And how far do you suppose they are?" asked the parson. "Probably 5 times as much, if not more. But they will not travel at night, and by sunrise we ought to be considerably nearer to them than now." "You can't be certain about that. Lieutenant Russell knows me too well to loiter on the road. He has a good horse, and the pony of Nellie is a tough animal. Both will be urged to the utmost, for they must be sure the pursuit will be a hard one." The discomforting fact in the situation was that if the fugitives, as they may be considered, pushed their flight with vigor, there was no reason why they should not prevent any lessening of the distance between them and their pursuers, and since they would naturally fear pursuit, it was to be expected that they would use all haste. The hope was that, on account of Nellie, the animals would not keep up the flight for so many hours out of the 24, as the pursuers would maintain it. The trail steadily ascended and became so rough and uneven that the horses frequently stumbled. This made their progress slow and compelled the 3 men, despite themselves, to feel the prudence of resting until daylight. But not one of them wished to do so, since the night pursuit was the only phase of the business which brought with it the belief that they were really lessening the distance separating them from the 2 in advance. Eager as the couple were to get through the mountains and reach Sacramento, where for the first time they could feel safe from their pursuers, the young officer was too wise to incur the risk of breaking down their horses, for such a mishap would be a most serious one indeed, and fraught with fatal consequences. There was little fear of the pursuers going astray. Captain Dawson had an extraordinary memory for places, as he repeatedly proved by recalling some landmark that he had noticed on his previous trip. Furthermore, the gorge was so narrow that in a certain sense, it may be said, they were fenced in, and would have found it hard to wander to the right or left had they made the effort. After an hour of steady climbing, they reached an altitude which brought with it a sharp change of temperature. The air became so chilly that Ruggles and Brush flung their blankets about their shoulders and found the protection added to their comfort. The horses, too, began to show the effects of their severe exertion. Their long rest had rendered them somewhat soft, though the hardening would be rapid. After a few days' work, they would not mind such exertion as that to which they were now forced. When a sort of amphitheater was reached, it was decided to draw rein for a brief while, out of sympathy for their panting animals. "I thought if we failed to find our horses," remarked the parson, "we wouldn't find it hard to keep up the pursuit on foot. I have changed my mind." He looked back over the sloping trail, which speedily vanished in the gloom, and the eyes of the other two were turned in the same direction. At the moment of doing so, the animals again became frightened, so that despite their fatigue, it was hard to restrain them. "There's something down there," remarked the captain, slipping from his saddle. "Wade, you are the nearest. Can you see anything?" Ruggles was out of the saddle in an instant, Winchester in hand. "I catched sight of something," he said in an undertone. "Look after my horse while I find out what it is." "Have a care," cautioned the parson. "It may be an Indian." "That's what I think it is," replied Ruggles, who instantly started down the trail, rifle in hand, his posture a crouching one and his senses strung to the highest point. He passed from view almost on the instant, and his companions listened with intense anxiety for what was to follow. Suddenly the sharp crack of their friend's rifle rang out in the solemn stillness, the report echoing again and again through the gorge, with an effect that was startling even to such experienced men. It was the only sound that came to them, and while they were wondering what it meant, Ruggles reappeared among them with the noiselessness of a shadow. "It was a bear," he explained. "I think he scented the animals and was following on the lookout for a chance at 'em." "Did you kill him?" "Don't think I did. He must have heard me comin' and was scared. He went down the trail faster than I could. When I seen that I couldn't catch him, I let fly without taking much aim. Maybe I hit him. Leastways, he traveled so much faster that I give it up and come back." The party lingered for half an hour more, but as the horses showed no further fear, they concluded that Bruin had taken to heart the lesson he received and would bother them no further. The mountains still towered on every hand. The stream had long since disappeared among the rocks, and the gorge had become narrower. Generally, it was no more than a dozen feet in width, occasionally expanding to 2 or 3 times that extent. The moon had moved over so far that only its faint reflection against the dark walls and masses of rock availed the horsemen. The sky seemed to contain an increasing number of clouds, and there were indications of a storm, which might not break for a day or two, and as likely as not would not break at all. The traveling, despite its difficulty, was comparatively safe. The trail did not lead along the sides of precipices, with a climbing wall on one side and a continuous descent on the other, but it was solid and extended across from one ridge to the other. Because of this fact, the three pushed their animals hard, knowing that it would not be long before they would have to be favored. "I don't know whether we are wise to keep this up as we are doing," said the captain, "but I know there are few places where we can travel in the darkness, and I feel like making the most of them." "It is only a question of what the horses are able to stand," replied Brush. "It is easy enough for us to ride, but a very different thing for them to carry us. We must guard against their breaking down." "I will look out for that. But it is strange that when we were making ready to start, we forgot one important matter." "What was that?" "We did not bring a mouthful of food. We shall have little trouble in shooting what game we need." "Perhaps not, and perhaps we shall. The lieutenant and I found on our way from Sacramento that, although game appeared to be plenty, it had an exasperating habit of keeping out of range when we particularly needed it. Delay will be necessary to get food, and the reports of our guns are likely to give warning just when it is dangerous." "It was a bad slip," assented the parson, "for there was plenty of meat and bread at home. But we shall have to stop now and then to rest our animals and to allow them to feed, and we can utilize such intervals by getting something for ourselves in the same line." "It isn't that, so much as the risk of apprising the two of their danger. In addition, it will be strange if we get through the mountains without a fight with the Indians. According to my recollection, we shall strike a region tomorrow or on the next day, where there will be the mischief to pay. 2 miles more of laborious work and another halt." For the first time, Parson Brush showed excitement. "Do you know," he said, "that someone is following us? There may be several, but I am sure of one at least, and he is on a horse."